My name is Damian Brady. Some of you may know me from previous jobs at Microsoft and even Octopus Deploy. I came to Wellington about 5 years ago to do a DevOps Days here. For those of you who remember that event, if you were around, the projector caught on fire, so I can only go up from that point. So yeah, I've been in the kind of software delivery space for 10 plus years. My background is in dev, but I've kind of seen a lot of companies go through this DevOps transformation, right? And I've seen almost as often as they go well, I've seen them go badly, right? Where the people on the ground, the engineers who are doing the work, end up in a worse state than they were before, right? And you could be forgiven for thinking, you know, if the DevOps transformation goes wrong all the time, then maybe it's the DevOps part that's the problem, not individual companies. I don't believe that to be true, and in fact, I'd go even further and say I don't think it's possible for DevOps to be a problem. Now let me explain why I say that, right? DevOps by definition is about improving your software delivery process to deliver value to your customers in a better way, right? There's a lot of different definitions for DevOps out there. I've always liked Donovan Brown's, not just because he was my boss when he came up with this, and so obviously everything he did was perfect, but it's a really good summary of what DevOps is about, right? So it's a union of people, process, and products or technologies to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. So there's a couple of things I want to point out in this definition. One is value. We are continuously delivering value. Not features, not code, not security patches, not bug fixes, nothing like that. We're delivering value. And as long as that's our target, then we can do DevOps in a good way. The other thing is continuously delivering this value. There's no point delivering a valuable feature 6 months after it's needed, right? So continuously delivering value. So when we look at this, we think things like automation, CI/CD, and all of that stuff that gets our code into production faster, right? So my suggestion is that if DevOps transformation has gone badly in your organization, it's not DevOps necessarily that's the problem, it's the way it's been implemented. So there's nothing wrong with DevOps itself. So great, Damian, right? You've effectively defended the word DevOps. Everybody's problems are solved, right? No, I'm not going to leave you like that. And in fact, not only have I not solved all of your problems, I've probably made things worse. Like, I'm the guy up on stage who's like, oh, you're not doing DevOps properly? Well, you need to do DevOps harder, and that'll fix the problem, right? It's not just unhelpful, that's actively harmful, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at why DevOps sometimes fails, DevOps implementations sometimes fail, but more importantly, how to evaluate whether you are doing the right things and how to adjust your course so that you can have success with your DevOps transformation. Right, we've seen this, something like this, the good old DevOps infinity symbol explaining what DevOps is about. And people kind of put this up there and they're like, oh yeah, it encompasses everything. What we see in practice when organizations implement DevOps is they tend to focus on just this bit, right? The automation of when the code is written, building that, making sure it's secure, making sure everything works, and then pushing that into production. And that's the bit that everybody puts all their effort into. Now, that is entirely valuable. It is absolutely an incredibly valuable thing to focus on. In fact, we get a lot of benefit from this. So CI/CD, or continuous integration, continuous delivery, or continuous deployment, can give you a huge amount of benefit for relatively low cost. So it's not generally that difficult to implement CI/CD in the scheme of things. I know some of you are there saying, are you kidding? It's horrible. But in the scheme of things, this is probably one of the easiest things you can do to improve your process. And it makes huge improvements. Like shortening that time from when code is written to when it's in production is hugely valuable. But this is not the only part of DevOps. And once this is working better, there's still significant problems in a lot of organizations for the rest of it, right? This implementation of CI/CD is valuable, but it hasn't changed the organization in a great way. All it means is people don't need to worry about copying files around anymore. So we really need to go to kind of step 2. What else do we need to change to effectively implement DevOps in organizations? And to do that, my suggestion is we need to go back to the fundamentals of what DevOps is about. So let's talk about these fundamentals. And look, there's a ton of ways you can mix and match and slice and dice the way that DevOps is defined and what it's about and so on. There are some really, really good leaders in this field, and I don't want to come up with any of my new kind of ways of describing DevOps and explaining what it is. What I prefer to do, though, is refer to some of these experts in the field. So some of my absolute favorite experts in the field at the moment are these three. So Dr. Nicole Forsgren, who currently is at Microsoft Research, but you probably know her from the DORA State of DevOps report. Gene Kim, who's the author of The Phoenix Project and The Unicorn Project, fantastic books that are extremely readable. They have fantastic DevOps messages, but they're written like novels, so you can actually read them without falling asleep in 5 minutes. They're really, really good. And of course, Jez Humble. So Gene Kim and Jez Humble are responsible for the DevOps Handbook, and these three together have released Accelerate, that I think we heard about earlier today as well. All fantastic pieces of literature. Dr. Nicole Forsgren, by the way, if you ever see any stats on the correlation between high-performing DevOps teams and organizational success, that research has almost certainly come from her. Right? She is an incredible researcher and actually puts figures behind all of these claims that people on stage like me make. So highly recommend following those people and looking at their stuff. So as I said, there's a lot of different ways to slice and dice what DevOps is and what it means. My favorite way of looking at what DevOps should do at the moment is Gene Kim's 5 ideals. So you may have seen these. These are 5 ideals for high-performing DevOps teams or for high-performing software delivery teams, right? Locality and simplicity, focus, flow, and joy, improvement of daily work, psychological safety, and customer focus. So these are things that if you do all of these well, you will have DevOps success. You will have success in your software engineering, software delivery practices. So I want to look at these in a little bit more detail, and we'll look at how we can tie them back to the practices that we do day to day. So I'm going to look at these first 3 together, and I'll explain why in a sec. Locality and simplicity is about being able to do your job without having to go to external teams to provision machines or to run scripts on your database servers and things like that. You can do your work in a local way, right? If you need to test something out, you can just test it in your local environment. Similarly, the architecture of your application needs to be simple enough that it's not an absolute chore to get something done. In other words, the work that you do is local and simple. You can get something done and out the door quite quickly and do everything you need to do. Focus, flow, and joy is along these lines as well. Like, can I focus on the work that's important to me? Can I continue to write that code, or do I need to stop every 10 minutes to go and do something over here? Or when I write a feature, do I need to stop while the build server puts it on a machine and then I can go and test it again and so on? So can I get into this flow state? And what leads from that is, am I enjoying my job? Right? Happy developers and happy engineers are much more effective in their organization. And then improvement of daily work extends that a little bit more, and it's talking about the processes that we follow as engineering teams and as an organization. Can we improve the way that we work on a day-to-day basis, right? Do our organizations get in the way of the way that we can actually deliver software? Now, the reason I talked about these 3 altogether, you've probably picked this up, I kind of put these all in the same kind of bucket, this improvement of daily work. And it may be improvement of the software engineering or the architecture of the software we're writing, or it may be improving the organizational structure so I don't have to go and write a change request form to get a SQL Server database provision so I can test my code, right? All of this, though, is about improving the way we work on a day-to-day basis. Now, Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, he famously had a quote shortly after he took the helm of Microsoft. And I'm going to paraphrase because I don't know the actual quote, but he basically said, if there's ever a choice between writing new features or improving the way we work, we should focus on improving the way we work every time, because the flow-on benefits from that are far greater than just implementing a feature. It's the whole sharpening the axe thing, right? We can keep chopping trees, but if we can sharpen the axe, we're more effective in the long term. So I like to group all these 3 together for improving the way that we work. The next 2, before I go into that, the way I see this actually implemented the most successfully across organizations is to kind of structure your organization in a vertical way. So vertical feature teams, self-sufficient, cross-functional feature teams. And what I mean by that is that the team that implements the feature should be responsible for everything from speaking to the customers and generating the ideas all the way to putting it in production and running it in production. What it means in practice is that we're kind of trying to avoid these silos and specialized or common services or cross-organizational teams, because at that point you are reaching out to somebody who has a different set of priorities and a different agenda to your team, which is getting the feature into production. If those skills are in your team has ownership of everything that goes into that product or that feature. That said, having center of excellence teams is fine as cross-functional teams, right? So a DevOps team in an organization that is kind of the person you go to or the team you go to help you get the most out of your DevOps processes. Those teams are great, as long as they're not the ones doing all the work, right? There's a great tweet I saw a while ago saying having a DevOps team that does all the DevOps is like having a communications team that does all the communication, right? Doesn't work. Like, if you have one person responsible for that, the ownership's gone, and your teams don't feel like they own either the feature they need to implement, they're being told what to do, and they don't own how it's running in production either. So that's really, really important for making sure that this daily work is local, simple, and you can get joy and focus from doing that work. All right, let's look at the other two. I'm going to do these in reverse order. So we're going to look at customer focus first. And we all talk about customer focus as a thing that we need to focus on, like make sure the customer their needs are met. But this is really about setting yourself a North Star, a thing to always think about, right? It may not be customers, it may be users. Maybe the software you're writing is for your internal teams. But the idea is to solve the problems that customer has. And I would go further and say that the idea here is to make the customer happy. Now, the cynical people in the crowd might be thinking, well, they don't have to be happy, they just have to have their needs met, right? And there's some truth to that. Like, many a company has become successful and continued to be successful on the back of vendor lock-in. I know of a few. But there's nothing more valuable in the market than having a customer who, unprompted, starts singing your praises about your product or your company, right? That's where you can get real growth in your organization. So to do this in practice, in the real world, the first thing I would say is don't get in the way of feedback. And again, we're talking a little bit about these vertical teams, right? If your customer has to go through your help desk and then that gets escalated through 3 layers of help desk, and then they maybe might speak to the BA who has some responsibility for your project before it actually gets to the engineer, you're getting in the way of the feedback, right? It shouldn't feel like fighting your way through to the boss to like give feedback about something that's not working. Let your engineers speak to the customers directly, right? Might be a difficult thing to implement in some organizations, but it is hugely beneficial. Like, a 2-minute conversation can save weeks of time and dozens of emails back and forth, right? Focus on what customers need, not necessarily what they ask for. And I don't mean this in a customers are stupid, they don't know what they want kind of way. I mean this in a drill down and find out what the actual problem is. Can we solve that problem? And why are we not solving that problem, right? Remember, customer focus is about solving that problem and making the customer happy. So make sure that you're focusing on that as a first point of contact. Techniques like feature flags and private previews are fantastic for this as well. So one thing that we do at GitHub is every feature that you see released on GitHub has gone through a process of an internal test, so we staff ship some stuff, private previews, public previews, some betas, and then goes into production. What that means in practice is by the time a feature gets released, so for example, the new issues and new projects stuff that went GA last week, I think, there were companies, large companies, that have been using that for close to a year, right, while we developed that feature. And that allows us in production to work out whether we are actually delivering value to customers before we release it to the broader environment. So feature flags and private previews are a great way of doing that. The other thing I would say is hypothesis-driven development. Don't expect that by the time you get that spec and that requirements doc on your desk, that is the thing you need to implement, and that will make everyone's life easier, right? It's just not true, right? It doesn't matter how sure you are about this feature. It's not until it's in production and being used that you can really evaluate whether it is adding value for your customers, right? So if you take it as a hypothesis, we think that this product or this feature that we've added is going to improve the lives of our customers. We're going to put it in production, but then we're going to put metrics and telemetry around it so we can tell whether it is causing people to be more efficient. And that requires a bit of thought. How do you judge whether somebody is effective or not, or whether you've improved their lives or not? So at Microsoft in the Azure DevOps team, I did a bit of stuff with them back when I was at Microsoft. They had a definition of done, and for those software engineers in here, you're probably familiar with a definition of done. That's the point at which you can say, I have completed this feature. I can move the sticky note from one side to the other, right? The definition of done at Microsoft in that team was not that the code is written, or that the code is written and fully tested, or even that the code is written and fully tested and running in production. The definition of done was the code is fully running in production and we are collecting telemetry to verify whether our hypothesis about this feature is correct or not, right? Which is a pretty extreme definition of done, but it is very much on customer focus, right? How do you know if you've delivered value unless you can tell whether people are finding it value? One simple way of doing this, talking about feature flags, is to allow people to turn a preview feature on and then measure how many of them turn it back off again, right? Super simple way of doing it, and it tells you a lot, right? Little pop-up saying, hey, we've revamped this page, would you like to try the new version? You say, yes, and then 3 days later, they turn it back off again. You've probably done something wrong, right? So those are things in practice, right? The ultimate goal here is you should be able to step back at any point and say, is what we have done improving the lives of our customers? Has it provided value to our customers? And if what you're doing is not evaluating that, then have a rethink. The last one I want to talk about is psychological safety. Now, I've seen this on some of the slides before. This is a really, really important thing, right? Psychological safety. And I want to drill into this in a little bit more detail, because it's one of those terms that gets thrown out a lot, but it actually appears in a lot of the research in a lot of places, especially from people like Dr. Nicole Forsgren and others. There is a positive correlation between organizations with high levels of, or teams with high levels of psychological safety and the output of that team, so the success of that team in making their customers happy and delivering software. And it goes further than that, actually. You can draw a correlation between a trusting, safe, psychologically safe team and company success according to their own metrics. So if your team feels like they're working in a safe environment and is happy, your company makes more money, right? There is actual research behind this. Look at Nicole Forsgren's stuff. It's a very strong relationship here. So, but let's talk about what is psychological safety really. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Psychological safety is about making sure that everybody on the team feels safe enough to do things like admit to mistakes, right? So I've worked in a number of organizations, or with a number of organizations, where a mistake happens and then the person who made the mistake tries to bury it because they are going to get in a lot of trouble if people find out. Has anybody had this? Yeah. Where you leak some credentials and you put them in your GitHub repo and you're like, oh, I'm just going to cycle those creds, find out where they're used, and then just delete it from the thing, try to rewrite my Git history, get rid of that issue because I'm in big trouble if people find that out, right? That is a terrible situation to be in, right? Because not only are you hiding the mistake and there's potential vulnerabilities that can come down the track from that, but you are also making sure that you are going to make that mistake again, right? A better scenario is if you can freely admit that that was a mistake that you made. It's met with understanding, because everybody makes mistakes, right? And then an effort to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So maybe you implement something like, this is the only thing of GitHub I'm going to mention now, but like secret scanning in GitHub, for example, which will tell you immediately when an API key has hit a repo, for example. Like, that's a really simple thing to implement, but if you've hidden that and you've decided not to tell anyone because you don't want to get in trouble, then you can't make that fix. You can't improve things, right? It's all very well to say, make sure you admit your mistakes, but the organization has to be in a state where it's not dangerous to admit those mistakes. I've been in organizations where people get an absolute earful if they make a mistake. And what do you think that does to the rest of their team, right? If they make a mistake, do you think they're going to admit to it? Of course not. Like, Brett just got almost fired for making a mistake. I'm going to bury this. And you can't learn from mistakes if you bury those mistakes. It goes further than mistakes though, right? It goes towards engendering an environment where people are trusted to challenge the status quo and maybe think about whether there's a better way of doing things and trying stuff, right? I'm going to ask a bit of a dangerous question. Who here does a daily stand-up? Yeah, most of the hands. All right, keep your hands up for the daily stand-ups. All right, now keep your hand up if you always find value from these daily stand-ups. Right? Oh, a lot more brave people than I thought. So for those of you who put your hand down, and those of you who kept your hand up because your manager's sitting next to you and something psychological safety, how comfortable would you feel in your organization to suggest, can we just try for a week not doing a daily stand-up and just see what happens, right? And that's a bit of an extreme example. Like, I can understand why you might not want to do that. But being trusted to do something like that, make that suggestion, hey, can we just try this? That's really what psychological safety is about. So, in practice, we've all probably heard of blameless retrospectives. They can be a positive and a negative. They're generally positive if they are truly blameless retrospectives. They're quite often a negative if somebody's called them a blameless retrospective, but it's really a subtle way of blaming somebody for something that's going wrong. So they're really good. Having regular formal introspection sessions, because sometimes you're too busy, right? You don't think about whether you should step back and change the way that you work. Focusing on improving your daily work too. Make that a priority. Don't just think about the fastest way to implement something and get it in production, but think about whether there are bottlenecks in your systems and your organization and your process that you need to fix as well. Now, the flip side of trust and having these trusting teams is ownership. And ownership is a fantastic thing when it comes to software delivery. Once again, we're back to these vertical feature teams, right? If I have been responsible for writing some code that's in production and I am able to speak to people when that goes wrong or when it doesn't meet their expectations, I really own that piece of work. It makes me feel far more fulfilled as an engineer, right? If I can speak to customers and think, hey, I actually have a really good idea for something that they might need, and I'm empowered to be able to add that to our backlog and work on that as a way of focusing on my customers, and my team and my organization has a high level of psychological safety, they trust that I'm trying to do a good job, then that leads to better performing teams. We get better software out the door, and we do it quicker, and we do it faster because there's less organizational roadblocks. All right. So, the number one lesson out of this, right, is that DevOps transformations generally need to be transformative. Quite often, organizations will say, right, we're doing DevOps now, which means your job title was a sysadmin, and now you're a DevOps engineer. And the devs, or the other way around, we're going to get rid of that team, and then the devs, now you do the infrastructure too, and now you're DevOps engineers. Those things don't work. There's no real transformation there. It's just assigning job titles to people and reworking some of those simple things. To do this, you really need to balance these three things off each other. So improving your daily work, the way your organization works and the way your team works, and even the way your software architecture works. Making sure you have a team that feels safe around each other and is trusting, not that people won't make mistakes, that trusting that they are doing their best work. Nobody wants to do a bad job. And then focusing on the customer, having that North Star of our job is to make features that make the customer happy. If you can evaluate all of your processes and the things that you do against these three items, then that is your path to successful DevOps in organizations. Thank you so much.